Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik with Figure It Out Productions. The following video is part of our Quick Shoot series.
Hey guys, it's Adam here, and this is part 5, the final part of my retrospective of the 6th generation of game consoles. And this for the final time, I just want to say thank you to you guys, because this series would never have happened if you guys hadn't en masse requested it. I never expected that, and thank you again for doing that. And so I hope you've enjoyed the series and enjoy this final part of it. So, the GameCube. This came out in 2001, November 2001. It came out like 2 or 3 days after the Xbox did. So it is the final entrance, but barely. And the thing about the GameCube is, it's hard to describe, but it feels like it has no feel. You know, if you're into consoles, you kind of know that game consoles traditionally have some sort of vibe or tone to them where you can you just remember it a certain way. And the console feels like it belongs in a certain category for people. I don't really know how to explain it. It's a hard thing to explain unless you're into it. But the GameCube feels exactly like it has no feel. And I think it was largely because Nintendo didn't know what it was. Nintendo didn't really seem to know how to present it to us. And as a result, it just feels like this black sheep in Nintendo's history. I'll give you a very tangible piece of evidence to what I'm talking about. When the GameCube came out, at launch, you had the black version and you had the purple version. Now, it's very apparent the purple version was intended for kids. And it looks like a child's toy. It really does. It's a small little cutesy chibi game console with a handle, and it looks like it's for babies. And then at the same time, they released the black one, which I guess is supposed to appeal to adults. I can't think of any other console that ever did that launched with 2 totally different versions of the same thing, trying to appeal to 2 different markets. That's weird to me. And I think that set the tone for the whole generation for them. Like, we have a new console. I don't know what it is. It kind of felt like Nintendo didn't want to move on beyond the N64. They simply had to, because obviously the N64 would not be competitive with the other 6th generation game consoles. So they basically, and the way it comes off is that they released it reluctantly. And it used this funky miniature disc format, which really did not help. Because this looks like a model of, like, you go to a grocery store or something and they sell like little fake plastic versions of good game consoles. Like, here's a PS Vita, is like this big and it has candy inside. You know what I'm talking about? I assume you do. It's the same thing. You look at it and you go, this is a cutesy little plastic thing that isn't a real game console. It's just supposed to be cute. That's the only way I can describe it. That's the way the GameCube kind of comes off. And I think they knew that. And they tried to fix it, which I'll talk about in a bit. But before I get into that, I want to talk about some other things that the GameCube did that were pretty cool. Now the GameCube, this was its controller, which I think is a really sweet controller. This was an awesome controller. It like melts into your hand. It's so comfortable, in my opinion. And the Nintendo actually was the first ones to give us a viable wireless controller. Now, of course, that's a standard now, but at the time that was ridiculously unheard of. And that's, of course, the Wavebird here. The Wavebird was, like I said, first viable one. Prior to that, you just had shitty ones that were like infrared based, and they were like line of sight little things that did not work worth a damn. I mean, consoles had them for generations, and they never worked particularly well. But this one really does. Unfortunately, it didn't have rumble support, but win some, lose some. So you got to give it credit for that. It created that. And now I know you're looking at this thing probably. This is the Panasonic GameCube. This was released only in Japan. I don't understand really the motivation behind releasing it. I mean, they clearly did a deal with Panasonic to push the GameCube and DVDs, kind of the way the PS2 did a little bit. And I don't know if there was at any point where they thought, we'll just replace this thing with this thing at some point down the line. I don't think that was the plan, but if it was, it would have been ridiculous, because you just look at it and you can tell it's expensive. This screen lights up and there's LEDs in there. It's ridiculous to think that this thing would have ever been practical. But it's very, very cool to have one. Now, the GameCube also did something awesome, just unbelievably awesome. It created, I think, in my opinion, the single greatest add-on in gaming history. and that was the Gameboy Player. Now I have the regular one. I don't know how well you can see it under there. It was clearly intended for the adults who wanted this one. It was not intended for the kids. And of course I have the one for the Panasonic Cube, which is a ridiculously rare thing. I'm so happy to have that. But now I know I keep it attached to this purple one, but that's because this is the one I use primarily. Now, of course, when they released this add-on, the GameCube was not doing well. And they thought, okay, the Game Boy Advance is doing incredibly well. What if we release this thing and maybe we'll get a bunch of people to buy GameCube so they can play those games on their TV? I still maintain, again, best add-on ever. Doesn't require a power supply. You just plug it in and you have a boot disc and bam, that's it. You're done. You're playing Game Boy, Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance on your TV. And if you have the appropriate cables, you can play it in 480p and it looks amazing. It is an awesome idea. But again, they didn't release a purple version, which tells you a lot. It was intended for the adults, but they didn't bother with the kids. Again, Nintendo didn't know what this thing was. Now, of course, using CDs, which is what every one of the developers wanted them to do, allowed them to win back a lot of developers. But because they used those miniature ones, basically they had a lot of gimped multiplats. You know, developers were temporarily satisfied because they were like, oh good, CDs, that's practical. But you again run into another problem they had with the N64, which was just limitation of size. You know, I mean, the GameCube discs hold like 1.4 gigs or something like that, whereas, you know, an Xbox disc could be upwards of 8 gigabytes if it's dual layer. Same with the PS2. Most of the PS2 games were like 4 gigabytes, and most of the Xbox games were 4 gigabytes as well, but that's a big difference. And it's not that the hardware wasn't capable of running the games, it's just that there wasn't enough storage capacity. So a lot of the time, they would either strip out a bunch of things, or they'd have to do multiple discs. And developers didn't really like that. So again, you had a situation where if developers were going to make a game for the GameCube, it was either going to be gimped or it was going to be exclusive to the GameCube. And exclusives are good, but it says a lot. It says like how hard it is for Nintendo now, especially, to get multiplats to their consoles because they have a way of just not doing what developers want them to do. And that was another piece of it, another piece of evidence there. So let's talk about some of the games. Now, again, when the GameCube came out, it again had this childish moniker towards it. People thought of it that way. And they wanted to fix that. And Nintendo, I swear, they made a legitimate effort. They really did. They really tried to win people over to the GameCube, saying like, no, this is not just for babies. I'm telling you, it's an awesome system. They released things like Resident Evil. Now, they, of course, didn't make this, but they did a deal with Capcom where, I don't know if you guys remember this, they secured all of the Resident Evil games. They're like exclusively coming to GameCube. We're getting remakes and reboots and remasters and so on, all for the GameCube. This is not a kid's console. And they got things like Metal Gear Solid Twin Snakes, which is an amazing, from the ground up remake of Metal Gear Solid 1, which is basically going to permanently stay exclusive to the GameCube because Hideo Kojima does not like this version. So this is definitely something to get the GameCube for. And they did Eternal Darkness, which is like supposed to be a creepy as shit game. My point is they tried, you know, and then they also fell on their first party titles, of course the big ones like Super Smash Brothers, and they went to Sega and actually got them to bring Sonic over. He was basically exclusive there for a while with Sonic Adventure 2 and all that, until they did that Sonic Heroes shit. Yeah, they just had a lot of, they tried. They really tried, and I think it's largely our fault, myself included, because I am not blameless at all in this, who just didn't embrace the GameCube properly. And we really should have. The Nintendo GameCube was just games or bust. And unfortunately it busted. And they moved past it pretty quick. I believe they dropped it in 07, very quickly after the Wii came out. Interestingly, the Wii was actually, the motion controllers of the Wii was actually just an add-on for the GameCube originally, and then they basically said, no, let's just get rid of the GameCube and move on. And so they retooled everything, they restructured, and the Wii became what it is, which is why it was so easy to play GameCube games on it. And the GameCube is interesting for another reason, because the console itself, I'm sure you're looking like, why do you have 3 of them there? Why do you have this 4th one? Why do you have all these GameCubes? This isn't even all of them that I have. Man, you can pick up GameCubes, just the core system, from Goodwill. Go into a Goodwill. you're gonna find a game. You're gonna find like 8 of these things for like $5 each. At least I know I do. You know, like, I don't go to them that often, but they're not hard to find for just the console. Unfortunately, where you start to run into problems is if you need controllers, games, accessories, any of that shit, it just becomes really expensive because that stuff is stuff that people use on their Wii. And of course, if they already have a GameCube. But, you know, there's no better time than now to pick up an actual GameCube. Yeah, I feel bad because I was partially responsible for this kind of thing. When the GameCube was commercially relevant, I didn't really care about it. I mean, my personal experience with it is, you know, I got it at Christmas and held on to it, didn't really play it much. I played some games like Super Monkey Ball and stuff. And then, you know, I kind of just said, eh, whatever. And I actually sold off most of those games and got the Xbox versions. And the GameCube really just sat around and had a couple of exclusives on it, and I never really played it. And in fact, it wasn't even until like 2 years ago that I really started to get more into the GameCube and really just kind of appreciate how much awesome stuff is on this console. Like, I didn't play Luigi's Mansion for the first time until maybe a year or 2 ago, and I realized this is an amazing game. This is like Resident Evil with Luigi and Mario. It's just a really solid, fun, awesome game. And there's just so many lost treasures on the GameCube that I highly recommend. And it's weird, I'm praising it nonstop here, but it's only my 3rd favorite console of that generation. You know, something had to come in 3rd. And I don't even know if it wouldn't come in top 5 of all time. It might come in top 10. I do like this console a lot, but yeah, I mean, it's not without its flaws. Like I said, you can't really enjoy multiplats on it. At least I know I can't. And unfortunately, a lot of its stuff is just really expensive, which is a big downer. It's somewhat import friendly, which is nice. If you have like Action Replay or something, or if you do a mod like this one, this is a switch right there that switches between American and Japanese mode. Playing PAL stuff's a little bit harder. You can import some games and try those out. This is an example of a PAL game. This is Doshin the Giant. This was actually originally intended and made and released for the Nintendo 64 DD. But since that bombed like hell and was only released in Japan, they remade the game from the ground up and released it for the GameCube in Japan and in Europe. Why they didn't release it in North America, I do not know. But there it is. And example of a Japanese game, this is Dream Mix TV World Fighters. If you like this game, you would love this game. It's essentially a clone of Super Smash Bros., but with completely different characters that basically wasn't released outside of Japan, likely for licensing reasons. And I don't recognize all the characters, but I'll name some of the ones I do. Bomberman, the Wolf Guy from Bloody Roar, Optimus Prime, Megatron, Solid Snake's in it actually. Barbie's in it. It's essentially, like I said, it's basically the same game, but with just different characters. It's very cool, and I highly recommend it. But yeah, that's kind of the GameCube. You know, it's a very good game console. It's very underrated. It's very underappreciated, but it's largely Nintendo's fault for not really making it clear what it even was or what it was supposed to be. And it's really fallen into Nintendo's, like, it's their black sheep console. Like, they don't really acknowledge it much. And, you know, if you look at the cover of any GameCube game, you can kind of tell that they didn't know what to do. Look at it. Look at the way the Nintendo logo looks. It's the only console they released where the Nintendo logo doesn't look like the traditional Nintendo logo. Were they trying to change it up? Obviously, but it felt like they didn't know how to transition. It just felt like a transition, like a hook between the N64 and the Wii, which is really what it was, I guess. So, my final thought on the GameCube is that if you can get them, get component cables for the GameCube. They're very expensive, which sucks. If you ever get lucky enough to find them cheap, pick them up. Most of you probably don't know this because very few people have component cables for the GameCube. On the back, assuming you have one of the earlier models of the GameCube, you'll see 2 ports. Now this big one is called Digital AV Out. Now there's a set of cables just for that port that allow you to connect it to modern TVs through component, and it supports 480p signals. And I'm telling you, because I was lucky enough to get a set of the cables, it looks amazing. They look beautiful. The games clean up so well. And almost all of them support it. Like, here's an example of a game that says it right on the box. Progressive scan compatible. Basically, if you have the cables, when you turn the console on, just hold down B, and it'll prompt you at the game at the beginning. It says, like, we've detected that you have component cables. Would you like us to enable progressive scan? Always say yes. And I'm telling you, your games will look so much better. It's just unfortunate that Nintendo really fucked up the release of those cables. They did not release them in Europe. They released them in North America in extremely limited quantities. And they released them in Japan slightly more widely, but still not by much. I mean, so the cables are unfortunately very hard to get. And that is actually really the biggest redeeming factor of this console's successor, the Wii. The component cables are obviously very affordable for that console, and the launch models, as you know, play GameCube games. So if you want to play the GameCube in the cleanest picture, either get component cables for this thing or pick up a Wii and get component cables for that and enjoy some really just truly phenomenal games. That's really all I have to say on the GameCube. I wish that I really had more to say. I feel bad because, like I said before, man, like, I feel responsible for not helping Nintendo when they last tried, because now they don't really try to cater to people like us. The Wii U is kind of turning that around a little bit, but not enough. So I wish Nintendo well, and I hope that the Wii U ends up being kind of the next GameCube, except successful. But, you know, who knows. So that's kind of the end of this series. I hope you guys have enjoyed it, and thank you for requesting it, and thank you, of course, for watching, and I'll see you all later.